yet another view on those comments by the KwaZulu-Natal Premier Sihle Zikalala. The comments he made yesterday saying that he believes the Constitutional Court should not be able to overrule Parliament, particularly when Parliament adopts certain policies, and that Parliament essentially should be supreme. You've seen political reaction to that. You saw political professor Lawrence Hamilton suggesting earlier on the newsfeed that there are different systems and that they are all worth exploring. Well, let's get a legal view. Professor Pierre de Vos is a professor of constitutional law at UCT. Professor, good afternoon to you. I think this claim for many has come as a surprise, coming from Premier Zikalala, that such a system where Parliament would be above the Constitutional Court. As I understand it at the moment, would I be right to say that that is not constitutional? That's just not how our Constitution works at the moment.
Well, the Constitution says not the Parliament and not the Constitutional Court are supreme. The Constitution is supreme. The Constitution is interpreted by the Constitutional Court and applied, but the Constitution can anytime be amended by the Parliament. So the claim factually that the Premier made is a little bit simplistic at best and false at worst. And the question then is, if the Constitution is supreme, if it can only be amended by Parliament, of course, politically, if two-thirds of the members of Parliament of the National Assembly supports an amendment or change to a supremacy system for Parliament, that would be perfectly permissible, except the founding values of the Constitution needs to be amended by 75% majority of the National Assembly. That will not be so easy to achieve under any circumstances. So it's probably not going to happen. The suggestion is not going to be implemented because the requisite majorities do not exist.
Okay, so just to sort of clarify this then, this is an interesting point that you've made, an important point that you've made, and Professor Lawrence Hamilton was sort of, making a slightly different point, but you're saying it's not Parliament that's supreme, it's not the courts that's supreme, it's the Constitution that's supreme, which means the argument then is around interpreting the Constitution.
Yeah, and so there are interesting questions about interpreting the Constitution. The problem is that these kind of discussions, at least when politicians get involved in it, is quite uninformed, not really based on what the Constitutional Court has actually done and how it has interpreted the laws. I sometimes disagree with the Constitutional Court, but compared with almost any other Constitutional Court in the world, except maybe Colombia or someplace like that, the court's jurisprudence is actually very progressive. It is less liberal, less reactionary than courts normally are in constitutional democracies with the Supreme Constitution. So once again, factually, the claims about the courts being impeding the policy implementation of the government of the day is probably not sustainable. Most of the problems of governance has to do with governance problems and not with the Constitutional Court ruling against the government.
So in a way, it's also a political problem. Mr. Zikalala and anyone can get around all of this by getting a 75% majority in an election.
Yes, if that is correct. And so you can change the Constitution. It is not impossible to change the Constitution, and it should never be impossible to change the Constitution because it's a democracy. So if enough people support the idea, it could be implemented. Whether it's a wise thing or not, that's of course another matter.
It seems, from what I can see, that Premier Zikalala is saying this particularly in reaction to a recent judgment, about the pre-qualification of people who would qualify, companies who would qualify under procurement regulations for government. It's a lot more complex than that. Did that judgment really say anything or stop government from implementing policies around preferential procurement or BEE or affirmative action or any policy like that?
No, it didn't do anything of the sort. In fact, with one exception, I think the Constitutional Court has okayed any kind of BEE affirmative action policies implemented. This judgment was whether the minister were given by Parliament the power to make the regulations that was in question. And the court found Parliament had not given the minister this power. So it's Parliament who didn't do their job or didn't give the minister enough power, or it's the minister that misinterpreted the law. whether the Constitution was supreme or not, the outcome would have been exactly the same because it didn't go to the substance of whether BEE and affirmative action is constitutionally valid. Our courts have many times said that it is, and that there will be a large margin of discretion for the policymakers when we test whether these policies are constitutionally compliant. So that is once again factually maybe a bit of a misleading claim to have made, if that was made. I didn't see it.
I mean, it's governing a country is very complex, and different countries do it in different ways. We chose a constitution, and we chose, as you say, the constitution must be supreme. We chose to have a judicial system to interpret that constitution, and we've seen sometimes very important judgments around, for example, in Kandla, in which the judges have interpreted the constitution in such a way as to stop the will of Parliament. In your view, is this necessarily the best way for our country with our history and our present?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there will always be contestation about the system, the constitutional system, about specific judgment of a court, especially if it's a constitutional supremacy system. The difficulty is that there are systems in which no Bill of Rights is in the Constitution. The courts cannot protect people's rights and so on. In our system, I think that the arguments in favor of a Supreme Constitution is quite strong because it is such a heterogeneous society. It is so full of conflict, and so a court that can enforce a Bill of Rights safeguards the rights and the political rights, other rights of individuals. But there are always counter-arguments, and, there's a big argument about whether this is not an anti-democratic system because the judges are not elected, yet they have to enforce the Constitution, which sometimes means they have to nullify decisions by the democratic branches of government. And there's always trade-off to be made. But in our context, I think potentially it will be worse not to have a Supreme Constitution and a constitutional court than it would be to have parliamentary supremacy.
There seems to be a huge tension between judges, to an extent the rule of law, but I think really judges and politicians at the moment. And I mean, this has been building up for years. Lawfare, it's sometimes called. This tension seems to be growing and growing, and of course maybe the culmination of that was the decision by the Constitutional Court last year to say that former President Jacob Zuma must serve jail time for defying an earlier Constitutional Court ruling that he must testify at the Zondo Commission. He was guilty of contempt of court. Do you worry that this tension is beginning to boil over in some way?
Well, it's part of a larger tendency, what people call lawfare, or the judicialization of politics, where highly political disputes are taken to the court. And it happens from Ace Magashula, who took the ANC to court, Jacob Zuma, who is trying to avoid prosecution, the DA, the EFF, about votes of no confidence. So obviously that is now going to force the Constitutional Court, for example, to make decisions that are politically significant. And it would be better if that didn't happen, and it poses the risk for the legitimacy and authority of the Constitutional Court. But the problem is, because the party political and the parliamentary kind of politics is so broken, people go to the court because it's the one part of the system that works relatively well. So in this sense, the courts are almost a victim of their own efficiency and success, not that they're perfectly efficient.
Professor Pierre de Vos, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Cape Town. Well.